stands today as proof that the unified field theory to a certain extent is correct. The result was complete invisibility of a ship and all of its crew.
Jessup assumed the letter came to him in response to a book he had published in 1955 called The Case for the UFO. The book had become the hot topic of the cocktail circuit in Washington, D.C., and an annotated copy even found its way to the Office of Naval Research, where the notations in the margins and above and below the text drew the attention of two ONR officers. The officers claimed that their interest was purely personal and had nothing to do with naval research. Still, they called Jessup in to evaluate the notations. Jessup received another letter from Allende within just a few days of the first. He opened his mail and read,
I wish to mention that somehow, also, the experimental ship disappeared from its Philadelphia dock and only a very few minutes later appeared at its other dock in the Norfolk-Portsmouth area. This was distinctly and clearly identified as being that place, but the ship then again disappeared and went back to the Philadelphia dock in only a very few minutes.
That assertion must have been a jolt to Jessup, since the two naval stations are some 400 miles apart. It would take days, not minutes, to get a destroyer-type vessel from one berth to the other and back. The letters seemed alternately desperate and angry, occasionally even pleading, and inexplicably, Jessup turned the letters over to the two naval officers who had the annotated copy of his book. He was sure, he told them, that at least some of the notations were Allende's. Whether or not Jessup ever made any further inquiries is unknown. His involvement ended on the evening of April 20th, 1959, when he was found dead in his station wagon in Dade County Park in Florida. Jessup, it appeared, had committed suicide. Jessup's friends insisted he was not the kind of man to commit suicide, but nothing was ever found to suggest anything else. But one thing was certain. In the 3 years since he received the first letter from Allende until his death, Jessup had been the main factor in seeing to it that the tight lid of secrecy surrounding the Philadelphia experiment was ripped away. The Navy, while insisting no such experiment ever took place, was nevertheless suddenly very interested in anyone requesting information about the USS Eldridge. And nearly 30 years later, this man, Alfred Bielek, would make it all but impossible to put the lid of secrecy back in place.
My original family name is Edward Cameron. When I first became aware of my involvement with the Philadelphia experiment in January of 1988, I had no idea how extensive my use by the government had been, nor where my research would lead. But it includes the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, mind control, some discussion of aliens, and it all fits together. Trying to understand how they fit together in the complex web that has been created is the purpose of my bringing to you vital information which has been kept from you by your government and the media.
What was the Philadelphia experiment exactly? And why would the U.S. Navy have been spearheading the research in the first place?
At the time that the Philadelphia experiment was supposed to have taken place, German U-boats were destroying nearly half of the shipping that was going across the Atlantic. Both the British Admiralty and the U.S. Navy were desperate in finding a way of combating this lethal threat. If scientists of the caliber of Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla had even remotely suggested the possibility of turning a large naval ship invisible, even if it was only invisible to enemy radar, the admirals would have certainly have decided to explore that option.
The stated purpose of the experiment was to prove whether or not you could make a ship invisible to radar. The original purpose was optical invisibility. Two scientists came forth with unproven theories which became part of this experiment. By 1943 in the United States, Einstein's concept of the ideas of the interaction of electricity, gravity, and magnetism seemed suited to the idea of electronic camouflage. But implementation of the theory would require the use of some of the concepts of another great scientist, Nikola Tesla. Tesla was the project originator and its first director. Einstein and others, including Dr. John von Neumann, worked together to perfect the theory. All of these men worked together very closely on this project, and I was privileged to work with them in my original Edward Cameron timeline.
The stage was now set for a journey into unexplored realms of science. But did the Navy, or even the scientists, know it would also be a journey into the future? Did any of them really believe it was possible for a massive warship to just suddenly become invisible? And who exactly is Ed Cameron? And what does his so-called timeline have to do with anything? Believe me, making the ship invisible is the easiest thing to believe. We'll be back in a moment with the really exciting part of the story. The ship chosen for the experiment was a recently commissioned destroyer escort named the USS Eldridge. So far as can be determined, none of the 180-plus men aboard the ship were told what the test was all about. All they knew was that they were going to make us invisible. But was this something the government would take seriously, even if scientists proposed it?
In the late 1970s, Dr. James Coram recruited a group of scientists, just for fun, to see if there was any scientific basis for the events that were supposed to have taken place during the Philadelphia experiment. To their astonishment, there was. In a laboratory, they were able to replicate radar invisibility using what is known as Tesla's egg of Columbus. So, it is entirely plausible that in 1943, they had the sufficient knowledge to conduct the Philadelphia experiment. In fact, from what was known of the technology, it would have been derelict behavior of the Defense Science Research Board not to have conducted such experiments.
The device invented by Tesla for producing high voltages with low current is today used in one form or another in most radio and TV sets. It permits weak circuits to sustain currents of almost any magnitude. His theories were perfect for the task at hand, but Tesla became disenchanted with the entire project. He was convinced that his inventions were being appropriated for purposes not beneficial to mankind.
The experiment was originally called Project Rainbow after it was classified, and it was executed in 2 parts. The trial run from the standpoint of invisibility went very well, but the effect on the sailors on deck was horrific. Sailors were sick, some were completely disoriented, but the objectives and goals of invisibility had been achieved. The decision was made to go ahead with the second phase of this test, with the test crew and 2 scientists on board. Those 2 scientists were myself and my brother. We also had on board my younger brother Jim, who was a Navy seaman and part of the test crew.
Tesla walked out on Project Rainbow in March of 1942 and was replaced by a man who, by war's end, would become a legend among scientists, Dr. John von Neumann. It's here that lives and timelines begin to converge.
I began my life on August 4th, 1916, in Bayshore, Long Island. My name then was Edward Cameron in that timeline. I and my brother Duncan grew up there. I went to Princeton in 1932, where I met Dr. John von Neumann for the first time. I later earned my PhD in physics at Harvard University, while Brother Duncan went on to University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he earned his PhD in physics.